All right. So, sorry about the technical difficulties, but I will begin. So, welcome everyone to the Albany Pine Bush. My name is Alex. I'm the field ecologist and entomologist here at the Pine Bush. And today I'm going to be talking about butterfly and moth diversity here. Here are some lovely examples of the butterflies and moths that we have in the Pine Bush. Just to start, I just want to talk about what butterflies and moths are. So they're both members of this insect order called Lepidoptera. I'm probably going to refer to them a lot in this presentation as just leps. That's just easier for me to say. We like to think of butterflies and moths as separate things. Most people think, oh, butterflies are the colorful things and moths are these dull things that come out at night. They're actually taxonomically pretty much the same thing. So the butterfly family here is right smack in the middle of all these different families of moths. And then here at the very bottom, these are macro moths. So these are most of the moths that you would see at night compared to our microleps, which are some of these smaller examples on the top and in the middle there. So some of our most beautifully patterned large moths, such as the giant silk moths, which most people are fans of. And then butterflies and moths undergo a complete metamorphosis. So they start as eggs, they hatch into larvae or caterpillars, they then pupate into the pupa, which is referred to as a chrysalis or a cocoon, and then they emerge as an adult butterfly. And that's compared to other insects that undergo an incomplete metamorphosis. So things like crickets and grasshoppers, they just kind of are small nymphal versions of themselves and they grow larger, but they kind of look the same throughout the entire process. So why do we care about butterflies and moths? They perform several vital ecosystem services to us and to the ecosystem. One of the main ways is as pollinators. Most of us know this. They pollinate plants. They also function as herbivores. This can be a good thing if they're controlling plant growth that's in excess, and it can also be a negative thing if they're feeding on crops and other plants as well. They function as prey. So this example is the eastern whippoorwill. They feed almost half of their diet or more is moths, like 58%. So they really, really rely on moths. A lot of birds rely on moths and then other predators as well. And then as bioindicators to tell us how healthy our ecosystem is. So here's an example of the eastern buck moth. They are indicator species for how healthy the pine barrens is. And I will talk about them a little bit more later as well. And we like looking at butterflies and moths because they are easy to see, they have visual appeal, and relatively are easy to identify. Some of them are not, but this is a great insect to study. I'm going to briefly talk about host plants because I mentioned them a lot further on. So host plants are specific plants that butterflies and moths use as a food source when they're larvae, so when they're a caterpillar. Adult butterflies and moths typically are feeding on things like nectar, sometimes from the host plant, but several other species of plant as well. And then sometimes some grosser things that have like sugar, salt, and moisture, like poop, animal sweat, animal blood, tears from animals sometimes, and then rotting fruit. And then some moths and butterflies lack mouth parts at all as adults, so they only live for a couple days, and they will not feed at all as adults. So they're only feeding as caterpillars. And an example of that would be some of our giant silk moths that do not have mouth parts. And then just want to talk about two kinds of feeders. So we have the generalist feeders that are feeding on multiple host plants across different species, different genera, different families. For example, it's a little bit cut off by the zoom up there, but we have the red-spotted purple butterfly, which feeds on several different kinds of trees, including oak, which is why I include it there. The polyphemus moth, which is one of our giant silk moths as well, feeds on oak, but also a lot of other trees. And then we have our specialists that typically will only feed on one single host plant or a few species that are in the same genus or family. So an example of that would be our milkweed feeders here. So I have the well-known monarch, and I also have this this moth, which is the milkweed tussock moth. So they feed on plants in the dogbane family, so milkweeds, specifically in a milkweed genus, but some other plants too. And then we have our lupin feeders. So on the far left there, I have our frosted elfin, which feeds on lupin, but also two other plants in the legume family. And then Karners are highly, highly specialized because they only feed on a single plant, which is the wild lupin plant that we have here in the pine bush. Leps that have only one host plant are more at risk of becoming endangered because if that host plant goes away, they have nothing to feed on. Sometimes leps do jump to different host plants, which is super cool. For example, another species of elfin called the Henry's elfin has jumped to this invasive buckthorn. So it started feeding on this invasive plant, which is super cool. And then not all leps feed on plants. Some larvae feed on fungus. And then we also have some carnivorous larvae, which will feed on, for example, there's a butterfly called the harvester, which is also here. It'll feed on aphids. So that's super cool. So unfortunately, butterflies and moths are in decline. They have declined across the contiguous US by a rate of 1.3% annually. This recent study looked at. This doesn't seem like a lot until we put it together several years. So from between 2000 and 2020, that has totaled to a 22% decline. And it's possible that many more butterflies are being lost because species that have limited data are already rare and in small populations. And this study did not look at moths, so I would expect to see a similar trend with them as well. And why are they declining? Probably the largest reason is habitat loss, but also things like the use of pesticides and then also climate change, because the two regions that were declining most steeply were the Southwest and the Mountain Prairie region, which have 8 of the 10 driest US states and the most rapidly warming climate areas. So I want to switch gears and talk about ecological succession. So succession is the structure and species composition of a biological community over time. So if you think of how humans have altered our landscape so heavily, think about the kinds of outdoor spaces that you see daily. Lots and lots of lawns, right? So a lawn, if we look at it at the very beginning of this successional process, is just a field with one species of grass. It's not supporting many insects, and it's definitely not supporting a lot of Lepidoptera that are depending on these host plants that we're not having a lot of diversity of host plants. We're not going to have a lot of butterflies and moths. So the natural process of succession is eventually leading us to these climax forests. Yes, you had a question? The 22% decline is overall the species that they looked at in the United States. I believe it was number of butterflies because they didn't look at all species. There was not data on all species. So I was talking about climax forests. So our climax forest in the eastern part of North America will have trees like American beech, sugar maple, eastern hemlock, and that kind of landscape is something that we would see in the Adirondacks. However, landscapes are subjected to disturbance all the time naturally. This could be extreme climate events, things like herbivores, like the bison out on the prairies, and then fire. This all happens naturally. This all happens to the landscape. So this creates a mosaic of habitats on the landscape. You're going to have some climax forests, but you're also going to have habitats that are in this middle area. So a lot of these habitats are oscillating between these stages. Um, so an example of like one of these earlier successional stages, like in the middle, would be the landscape that we're all sitting near right now, which is the pine barrens. So this kind of habitat is remaining in the state because of this constant disturbance, constant fire, which was happening naturally and is now happening with prescribed burns. So as humans, we're either constraining the landscape by not allowing any kinds of plants to grow, only the plants that we want, or non-native plants, or by preventing natural disturbance like fire. So we're allowing these climax forests to happen, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we also lose these intersuccessional stages in the in-between, and then all these species adapted to them. So all these butterflies and moths in the middle, we're losing those as well when we allow that to happen. So how do we get back to that stage in the middle? We here use, in the pine bush, two main management strategies. So that's system-based management, which restores the ecosystem itself, and then reintroduces these processes that maintain the ecosystem, like fire. And then species-based management, which bolsters populations of certain species that are in need of help, like the Karner blue. So for system-based, we're using a mix of mechanical, chemical, fire management to convert these communities that have been altered by this fire suppression by invasive species that are being brought in. And then once we've reverted them back to the natural state that they are, it supports things like Karner blues and then other species that are dependent on these intersuccessional habitats like the pine barrens. And then once they've been restored, they're maintained with mowing and burning. And in terms of species-based management, we plant nectar species and host plants to support them specifically. And we've also captive reared and released Karners into the preserve in areas where they were absent, and they are now found. So when this happened in the past, we took gravid females, so that means females that are ready to lay their eggs. We raised eggs and larvae, and then when the pupa were ready to emerge, we put them into these little butterfly houses with some nectar species. Once they emerged, they were released into areas of the preserve. So that is an example of how we bring back these habitats and restore them. So again, because much of Eastern North America has lost these mid-successional habitats like pine barrens, by restoring the habitat here to bring back the Karner, we've also brought back other species of leps that have come back just because of the management practices, kind of in an indirect way. So they are adapted to this shrubby mid-successional habitat. So when we bring that back, these remnant populations will increase as well. So pine barrens habitats are containing host plants for leps that are rare elsewhere. You're not going to find these kinds of plants in a hardwood forest, and especially not on your lawn, unless you plant them, but they might die. And this is because of a combination of these dry, sandy soils, this open canopy that's letting in all this sunlight, and then things like fire. So these specific plants, the plants that are occurring in pine barrens, are adapted to dry soil that has very little nutrients, direct sunlight, which not all plants like, and they're adapted to deal with fire, frequent fire. And then the open canopy also helps leps as well. Butterflies really like sunshine. You can find them in right of way, on the side of the road, anywhere that has open areas where nectar species are growing and where they can thermoregulate better in the sun. Of course, there's other exceptions to that rule. There are butterflies and moths that love the deep forest as well. So then within the pine bush as well, we have successional variants too. And that increases the diversity of leps that we have as well. It creates these temperature gradients and then slightly different species structure and composition that supports a number of species. So we have successional northern sandplain grassland, which has the least amount of tree cover. the pitch pine scrub oak barrens, pitch pine scrub oak thicket, and then pitch pine scrub oak, not pitch pine oak forest. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about directly some of the species that we have, highlight some of them. And I'm going to start with the Karner, of course. So the Karner is a very small blue butterfly. It is only has an inch wingspan, and it is in a family of butterflies known as gossamer winged butterflies. Karners are sexually dimorphic. So the male on the top, he is completely blue on the top of his wings, while the female has a row of orange and black submarginal spots there. The Karner has 2 broods or generations in a year. So sometime in April, the first eggs are hatching, and they will feed on the leaves of the lupin plant. Here's the lupin plant. That's the only plant that they feed on. So about mid-May, the caterpillars pupate, and then the adult butterflies emerge from the chrysalis about the end of May, early June. I did actually see my first Karners of the year today. I had 2. So they're starting to emerge. Then these adults lay their eggs, which will hatch in about a week. They'll stay as caterpillars for about 3 weeks, feeding on the lupin. Then they pupate, and the summer's second generation emerges in July. So that is typically a larger generation. There are more individual butterflies in that generation than the first. And then those adults lay eggs that will not hatch until the next spring. So they overwinter as eggs. They're staying the whole winter as these tiny, tiny eggs. In terms of habitat, like I said, Karners are found in these oak savannas and pine barrens, which are just dry, scrubby habitat. And then maintaining these habitats is important for maintaining the butterfly itself. The Karner is endangered. It's listed both by New York State and federally as an endangered species. So in this top map, you can see the historic range in yellow. So that is where they used to occur. And then in those dotted areas, those are recovery units. So those are areas where Karner populations persisted in very, very small numbers. The Albany Pine Bush is within the New York State Recovery Unit. So that's the Glacial Lake Albany Recovery Unit. There's a couple other places in the capital region that can maintain Karners because of their habitat. But Albany is also the type locality for the Karner. So that basically means this is where they first described a Karner blue butterfly. And then I can't talk about the Karners without their lookalikes. So all the time we get calls, oh, I have a Karner in my backyard. Oh, I saw a Karner, I don't know, in Long Island. And that's probably not the case because there are other small blue butterflies that look very, very similar to them. So on the left, these are azures. I don't have a specific species because they're very complicated taxonomically. Until very recently, they thought they were all the same species, and then they figured out that there's actually like 4 or 5, but they're really hard to identify. So in general, they don't have any orange on the sides of their wings like Karners do. And then the eastern-tailed blue does have orange, but it's only in a very small area, just like 2 spots, whereas the Karner will have an entire row of orange spots on that submarginal part of the wing. And then they also have little tails. Sometimes they wear off when the butterfly is a little old, but they're the only little blue butterfly that's going to have those tails. They're also a bit smaller than the Karner. Next, I'm going to talk about the frosted elfin. So the frosted elfin is another very small species of butterfly. That's a picture I took. That we have here in the pine bush. It's another gossamer winged butterfly, just like the Karner. And it also feeds on lupin. Interestingly, the Karners only feed on the leaves, and the elfins will feed on the flowers and the buds. So different parts of the plant that they prefer. Another subpopulation, though, kind of in the Hudson Valley in Long Island, feeds on this plant, which is yellow wild indigo. So kind of in the same genus, like I said. not the same genus, the same family. But the ones up here are only feeding on lupin. So elfins, just like Karners, are associated with pine barrens, oak savannas, and also these dry oak forests. It seems like they kind of prefer shade a little bit more than the Karners do. So whereas the Karner has 2 broods, the elfin only has 1. So they will overwinter as pupa. The Karners are overwintering as eggs. So these ones overwinter as pupa, and they're ready to go right out of the bat once it starts getting warm. So around mid-April, they'll start emerging. And they fly until late May. So this is the first year we've been monitoring elfins by their population abundance. And they're starting to drop off. I only saw 4 today, whereas I was seeing like hundreds in the middle of May, or late April, I would say. It's the middle of May right now. And then elfins have a bit of a wider range than the Karner. They occur in these tan areas. They are extirpated in a few states, which means they no longer exist there, and they're gone from Canada. And then, although this range looks encompassing, like, oh, they're in all of these states, they're fine. Again, they're only in those remnant areas that are shrubby, like the pine barrens and oak savannas that occur in these states. So they're not across the entire eastern seaboard that it looks like. And they are listed as critically imperiled or imperiled. There's not enough data to know which it is in New York State and in a couple other states, I think Connecticut and Michigan. And potentially they will become endangered or are endangered, and we just don't have enough data to know. But they are pretty populous here, at least. Next, I want to talk about the mottled dusky wing. So the mottled dusky wing is a spread wing skipper. I'm sorry that you cannot see the names on the top. It's covered. My cursor has no bearing on what's going on up there. So mottled dusky wing, it's a part of a group of dusky wing butterflies. They look very, very similar. There's a lot of dusky wings. If you've ever seen one. They can be really hard to distinguish, especially with the naked eye. But mottled dusky wings, I find them a little bit more easy to identify than other ones because of this mottled appearance that they have, heavily spotted on both the forewing and the hind wing. And sometimes when they first emerge, they kind of have like a purple iridescence, which you can't really see once they're like all tattered. But if I see a purplish dusky wing, I'm like, oh, it's a mottled dusky wing. Oh, I forgot. This is what the caterpillar looks like. I think it's super cool. And then they're found in this like dry, brushy, scrubby area. Again, pine barrens. And then open woodlands too that have their host plant, which is New Jersey tea, which is this plant right here. New Jersey tea is a fire adapted plant. So it has a super deep, extensive root system that makes it one of the most fire resistant shrubs. And then studies have shown that fire may actually improve the germination rates of their seeds. So that's pretty cool. And I don't have a photo of the range because a photo of the range does not exist. We only have kind of records of where people have seen them before. But the current range is probably drastically smaller than what it once was. It's apparently extirpated from most of New England. Again, that means no longer exists there. New Jersey, possibly all of Pennsylvania. Most of Maryland, very rare in West Virginia and Ohio. It's not doing well. And then there are remnant populations in Ontario, Canada. And they're trying pretty hard to reintroduce the butterfly and bolster those remnant populations. However, since 2001, it still exists in 3 counties in New York. So we're doing something right. And they're pretty common here. Like I see them pretty frequently. My next one, you can't see that one either. The inland barrens buck moths. This is a giant silk moth, just like Luna moths, Polyphemus moths, Cecropia moths, all are big boys. They're fairly large moths. They're black and they have those white band across the hind wing and the forewing. Male buck moths have this rusty red patch on the end of their abdomen. Female buck moths don't have that, so you can sex them pretty well. And the caterpillars are really spiky. These spines that they have are hollow and inject venom connect to venom glands. So if you touch this caterpillar with your hand, you will probably have an allergic reaction to their venom. Super burning and itching, causes inflammation like a bee sting. So don't handle those caterpillars. And honestly, if you see a spiky, crazy looking caterpillar, don't handle it at all because it's probably also going to do the same thing. There are quite a few subspecies of buck moth. Honestly, they keep changing the taxonomy, which is super confusing. But we consider the subspecies that we have here Hemeluca maya. So that end part is the subspecies. The inland barrens buck moth, which is different from the coastal barrens buck moth, which is found in Cape Cod and Long Island, which is different from eastern buck moth, which is found like all across the eastern half of the United States. Buck moths feed on oaks. Pretty much exclusively. Some of them feed on oak trees, but the ones that we have here are feeding on our scrub oak exclusively. And then buck moth life cycle, the eggs are laid in the fall and they overwinter as eggs, just like Karners do. The female moth lays the eggs in that kind of like corncob looking thing on scrub oak twigs. If you're wondering how they survive through the winter, they have a waxy coating, and then they kind of have a compound that's like antifreeze inside, which is cool. Prevents them from drying out and freezing. And also the snowpack keeps them pretty warm, but snow is a dying thing. I can't do anything. It's okay.
I'm sorry.
I'm chilling. So sorry, I lost my train of thought. So it's all right. The eggs hatch in May, so they're hatching right about now. I actually did find very, very tiny first instar buck moth caterpillars the other day. They eat the scrub oak right when it comes out, so it's super fresh and easy to digest. Once the scrub oak gets older, it's full of like tannins and hard for them to eat. So for the first 1 to 3 instars, they're in this like protective cluster with each other. This kind of keeps them away from, scares predators like, oh, don't eat me, I'm in a cluster. And then once they get bigger, they'll break off and pupate. They pupate underground or like a little bit under the leaf litter. And then they emerge as adult moths in the fall, which is pretty unique. And they are day flying moths, so they'll fly around and you can see them in it's like a period of 2 weeks from like late September to early October. And then I just want to briefly talk about all of these guys. So these are considered rare shrubland Lepidoptera, and these are ones that have been found in the preserve with moth surveys in the past couple of years. Pretty much all of these are critically imperiled in New York State, which means that they are about to disappear, but they persist here in the pine bush. Just to briefly talk about some of them, this barrens dagger feeds on scrub oak. The New Jersey tea inchworm, as the name suggests, feeds on New Jersey tea. It's a super important plant for a lot of these barrens, moths and butterflies. This really colorful one on the bottom there also feeds on New Jersey tea. That is a picture of the bottom of the moth. The top is not as pretty, so I decided to choose that one. Cermacora is a super, super beautiful moth. They feed on the leaves of fire cherry, which is Prunus pennsylvanica, which is a fire-adapted plant, as the name suggests. I'm trying to see if there's any more that I definitely want to talk about. Oh, some of these graze on fungi in the leaf litter. So the barrens, chitonics, I don't know how to pronounce. I've never said anything. I've never said these names in front of anyone before. I've just read them. So I don't know. And they're kind of, some of them are dull, but when you look closely, they have such beautiful patterns and they're just super cool. And this is just a subset. There's a ton of other ones that I could not fit on this slide. So next, I just want to talk about monitoring projects that we have. So we've done all this work restoring this habitat. So we want to know how well we restored it. And most of that is through our monitoring projects, mostly monitoring for Karners, but like I mentioned, this year we've started monitoring for frosted elfins as well. So we've been monitoring the Karner population since 2007 using this method called distance sampling. So you can see the person there is distance sampling using this very long pole. If you've ever seen anyone in the preserve with a really long pole, that is what they're doing. They're not pole vaulting in the preserve, I promise. And this actually helps us estimate abundance, not just presence, absence. Oh, the Karner's here. We actually know how many Karners there are using this method. So each of the sites that we survey is covered in a series of these transects. One survey includes all the transects at the sites, and we do upwards of 30 surveys in a season across both Karner broods and now the elfin brood as well. And the transects are marked with these red flags. So if you've ever walked in the preserve and you've seen these red flags, that's what these are for. And they frequently end at trails, so you might see them. I put those there. So we walk along with this long pole, and the pole is marked with tape that shows different distances, so different distance intervals in meters. So we see a butterfly at a certain distance, we can note it, and we use a recorder because it would be super annoying to write that down while you're holding a pole. So that's what we do. And then another form of monitoring is monitoring the host plant density, so lupin stem counts, and then nectar species composition and structure. So how many nectar species do we have that are supporting these species, which we do at a subsection of the sites that we're monitoring butterflies at. So just want to show you guys this graph. So this is the result of our efforts in monitoring. So this is a graph of Karner population over time at the Albany Pine Bush. So note that there are two different broods because, like I said, the Karner has two different generations a year. So brood number 1 is in red and brood number 2 is in blue. And you can kind of see that the second brood is always larger. And also note the bar graph in the back, that is the survey area, which has increased over time. We've started surveying more areas of the preserve because they've been brought back to pine barrens, and the habitat is more suitable for Karners. So that little dotted line is the federal criteria to recover the species. That's 3,000 butterflies. So we need at least 3,000 butterflies across either the first or second brood in 4 or 5 consecutive years. So in 2013, that threshold was exceeded for the first time by the second brood. And then ever since, it's been over that by like quite a lot. So overall recovery efforts are doing really well. There's a lot of Karners. And you can see last year was about 25,000 individual butterflies. And I also just want to point out that this is just a subsection of areas of the preserve. There could be more that we are just not surveying for. And in 2020, it wasn't because of the pandemic that there were no people. It was just a really good weather year. Insects have boom and bust cycles. You don't know. You have a question?
You say there's 25,000 Karners now in the preserve?
Not right now. Last year there was a total number of all the Karners that were yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, right now there's probably like 100 Karners possibly, but we'll see. Yeah, there's 2 at least. I can guarantee there's 2. And then monitoring moths is a little bit different because most of them are nocturnal. I included the buck moth. It's not nocturnal though. So what about moths? So admittedly, there's not a lot of long-term monitoring for moths in the preserve. There's been a couple big picture surveys that have been done. So these survey methods I'm going to talk about in a second have been done in certain years and taken like a large subsection of like, oh, we know all these species are here at this specific day, but we want to know more long-term changes over time with moth surveys. So I want to implement more moth surveys. So ways that we can do that is with UV sampling. So moths love light. So we use UV lights to attract them. So the first one is this bucket trap. So it's just a 5-gallon bucket. with a funnel inside and then a light source. So the moths are attracted to the light source, they go through the funnel and they land in egg cartons, which they stay at overnight to feel like safe in there. And then you can open it up and check them the next morning. And then there is moth sheets, which are a little more fun, but also there's some negatives to that, being that the moths could leave at any time and you might miss them. So, but the purpose of the sheet is that it not only helps reflect the light of the white, the light that's hanging is reflecting off the white and making it even brighter to the moth, and also provides a surface for the moths to rest on so that you can look at them. And then we have community scientists in the preserve that help us monitor buck moths. So like I said, these adult moths are emerging in early fall and they're remaining active for about 2 weeks. So during that period, the male buck moths are flying around and they're pretty big moths and they're pretty obvious and they have a funny little flight. So you can see them pretty well. So we have our community scientists come to one of these locations. They stand in a predetermined direction and they see moths as they fly by and count them in their sight. So this year, I finally put together the data and community scientists counted 132 moths, buck moths during that 2-week period. So that was the highest number since 2019. So that's pretty great. And that's kind of all I have for you guys. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
The Karner, when they overwinter,
Mhm.
what they winter in, like, or on?
So they're kind of just overwintering on the soil. And the snowpack is protecting them from temperature fluctuations for the most part. Yeah, or they'll overwinter on like dead lupin stems.
That's what I wondered.
Yeah.
Follow up to that, how does the second brood know to not hatch?
So it hasn't been hatched yet. It hasn't been laid.
Well, I know that, what I mean is, so the second brood.
Oh, okay. I think I know what you
emerge, and then
mean.
go
They
to
overwinter.
lay.
Yeah.
Right, the second brood like lays the next egg. How do those eggs know? Like, it's still summer, it's still warm,
Yeah.
there's still tons of sunlight.
So that's the kind of question that I don't think science really has a lot of answers for. I think probably there's like a genetic difference between the two Karner broods, and they kind of just stay until they overwinter. But I honestly don't really know. So yes.
Do you know much about the fires? I had a couple questions. When was the fire that we see out here? When was that
This one back here,
start? When,
I believe that was April 28th.
and how do they keep the fire spreading?
So that's a question that I would direct to our fire manager because I have no idea. I'm about bugs. Yeah.
So, when you will prescribe for we have like management units, so Tyler will pick a management unit. And then they have a fire break around that management unit, which means that everything is down to the mineral soil, so the sandy soil, so that nothing can go past that area. And also there's people that are working the fire that are around the whole exterior.
Like
so that
wetting
we
it down
know
too.
that
Yeah, I kind of knew that answer, but
You knew that.
I knew it. I promise. Yes.
No, that's the only thing, but we find that the only thing. If you put eggs on a different plant.
They would not eat it. So the question was, how do we know that they only feed on lupin? So scientists test them in the lab. They'll give them a bunch of different leaves to eat, and they only will eat the lupin.
Well, how do they know that?
I don't know. The volatile chemicals that they can sense and smell using insect senses. It's also possible that it's not tasty to them, so they might start eating it and be like, oh, that's really gross. But I'm not 100% sure how they know how to do that, but that's just kind of like the sense that the volatile chemicals in certain plants are just not tasty or do not smell good to certain insects. So That's an answer. Yes.
I'm guessing, but I don't really know, birds and other insects or whatever that are preying on the caterpillars and moths, are they preying on, each stage, eggs, pupa?
Well, in the case of the whippoorwills, they're only preying on the adults because they're flying and they're aerial predators, so they're catching them that way. But certain species of bird are probably feeding on both caterpillars and adults. I'm not sure if they're feeding on eggs in terms of birds. I feel like egg predators would probably be more in line with insect predators because just they're small and don't have much nutritional value to a bird. And most of the pupa are pretty well hidden on purpose because they can't escape from predators in that stage. So they'll put themselves underground, or in the case of certain moths, they wrap silk around themselves. So it's like not easy to eat and probably tastes disgusting. So yes. I'm just gonna see if there's any questions online. So my face is over it.
How many farmers are believed to be?
So I do not know how many would be the total across the entire preserve. But we estimate the abundance using a brood curve. Like we try to fit it as well as we can. That question would probably be answered best by Steve, Steve Campbell, our conservation biologist. He does all that stat stuff. So not 100% sure. Are there any other questions?
Yeah. John asks, what about swallows and butterflies? How are they doing?
I actually saw some swallowtails today. They do pretty well, especially the spicebush swallowtails. I see them all the time. We're not specifically monitoring for them, but they're out there, so. And they're pretty generalists as well. They do feed on spicebush, as the name suggests, but they feed on some other plants too, and they're common in other areas. A lot of our focus is on butterflies and moths that are only found in these pine barrens habitats, so. Yeah. Oh, wait, sorry. Just here.
Bush areas like on Long Island.
Mhm.
Is there a lack of blue corner butterflies because of the lack of the lupine or because they were never reintroduced? It looked like original
Mhm.
were down there. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
There are other environmental areas that are similar to.
Yeah.
The pine bush.
So I'm actually from Long Island, so I know a lot about the pine bush down there. And the reason why is because that pine barrens is degraded. It has not burned for many, many years. And it's just like pitch pines like this close to each other. It's just not a healthy ecosystem. The canopy is very close. It would not support Karners. And lupin is gone from there as well because lupin loves sandy soil and it loves open canopy. So it's just not, they could, but they're probably, that would take a lot of work because the pine barrens down there are even bigger and they're just super degraded. So. Yep. Yeah.
What's the species that you said that eats buckthorn?
That's the Henry's elfin. Yeah. So, I can't remember what they feed on normally, but they've kind of switched to that and might like make it their host plant, like for real. So interesting.
Any studies been done on using ultraviolet light, the butterflies and all that on the plate?
Yes,
Birds-
yes.
Birds
Mhm.
see ultraviolet.
Yeah, so both elfin and Karner caterpillars glow in UV, so there has been use of UV lamps or the lights that we have and walking through and counting caterpillars as well because they do glow. That's not something I've done, but I think it has been done here before. But the butterfly distance sampling has been like a better way to get abundances, I think.
Look at the predation.
Yeah. Yeah, but definitely they do glow. Yeah. 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 So any other questions? Yes.
Congrats on bringing the bugs back. But also, are there other sort of like moths or butterflies that you're looking to try to like put a serious effort into bringing back here?
Yes, but I don't think I can talk about it.
Oh.
Because it's not real yet, so yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
What's your favorite bird?
My favorite bug? Oh man. I don't know if I have a favorite species, but my favorite order is obviously Lepidoptera. I'm also a big fan of Neuroptera, which is the lacewings. I don't know. It's really hard to say. Probably some kind of giant silk moth or an emperor moth or something like that is my favorite. Are there any more comments online? Okay. So it really depends on the species. In the terms of the Karner, they're not going very far. Elfins, they're found within like 50 meters of their host plant. They're not strong flyers and they're not going very far. So I don't know the exact number in my head. I'm sure it's like known, but I don't know off the top of my head.
So a lot of people have been planting a lot more natives in their
Mhm.
yards.
Yeah.
And I always have heard of creating corridors.
Yes.
So that there's less space because they're not strong flyers.
Mhm.
Is there any research that's been done to show that that is promising and is helping? That, you know, when particularly people who do in fact live in the pine bush,
I think,
I mean,
yeah.
even anecdotally.
Yeah, I'm not sure of any like research off the top of my head, but for us, like adding parcels to the preserve is always like very positive. We always want to increase like corridors and because we're super fragmented and increasing the habitat size is super important. So but I think, yeah, me personally, I think it helps, but I don't have any like research studies in my head right now.
I just wondered if like traveling around, if you just noticed that, oh my gosh, in this little residential neighborhood, I'm seeing some gardeners.
A lot of times, like farmers will plant plants for pollinators,
Mhm.
like along the edges and things like that.
Yeah.
Just to do that, to make those corridors, and it helps the butterflies and helps the farmers, because that helps the pollinators.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't really go into people's backyards to see.
Backyard.
So I'm not entirely sure, but I mean, they're like right up against people's yards sometimes. So if they increased habitat in their own yards, I'm sure that would be helpful. So, does Clem have any more people online? I'll take a couple more questions. I don't even know what time I'm at.
And someone has asked, how does the native bluefin compare to the blue bar variety of the west coast of
The like broadleaf lupin. I mean, which way would it compare? I guess Karners are not feeding on that introduced lupin. If you plant that lupin in your yard, they're not going to be feeding on that. It's not, and honestly, not much here is going to feed on that plant because nothing native is using it. They didn't evolve with that plant, so it's showy and bigger than our lupin, but it's not used by Karners. Yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful plant, but it's not. Yeah. Yeah. That's what happens with like certain milkweed varieties. But yeah. All right. If there's no more questions, then I'm good. You also can talk to me after when I'm done. So
Thank you.